The sun rises over Blue Ridge. The sun spilled over the rolling hills of Blue Ridge, casting a pale golden hue onto the sleepy streets below. It was an oppressively hot Tuesday morning in August when Admam Thoson stepped out of his old pickup truck, squinting toward the Blue Ridge Police Department building. He wasn't in uniform. There was no sign that he was the newly appointed police chief. Just a tall man in a plaid button-down, faded jeans, and a pair of well-worn sneakers. Admam knew his mission, but before he could reform a department shrouded in rumors of corruption and bias, he had to do one thing first: observe them when they weren't wearing their masks. Official meetings and staged welcomes wouldn't reveal the truth. Only by blending in, by watching unannounced, would he see the department for what it really was. From the parking lot, he walked toward the side entrance of the precinct, where officers moved in and out, laughing and chatting. They didn't notice him. A group gathered near the reception desk, exchanging morning banter. The scent of stale coffee mixed with the ringing of phones and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards. A few glanced at him, but no one recognized him. That wasn't surprising. His appointment had been announced only days ago, and he had chosen to keep his arrival unpublicized until the official meeting. He strolled past the break area, where a few officers stood around sipping coffee, discussing recent cases. But just as he reached the front desk, a voice cut through the morning chatter. "Well, what do we have here?" Admam turned to see a white officer striding toward him. The man was broad-shouldered, his short blonde hair cropped neatly. The name on his badge read Bray. There was something in his eyes, a mix of amusement and contempt. "Lost, are we? This ain't a shelter, my friend." Bray smirked, crossing his arms. "You need to take your mess somewhere else." Laughter erupted behind him. A few officers leaned against desks, exchanging glances of amusement. Someone muttered something under their breath, and the others chuckled. Admam didn't react immediately. He studied Bray, then the others around him. They were watching, waiting to see what he would do. He could reveal who he was, shut this nonsense down with a single sentence. But no, he needed to see if this was how they treated everyone, or just him. Bray's grin widened. "I told you, get out of here. We don't need your kind hanging around." No one intervened. No one spoke up. Admam felt his jaw tighten. He wasn't a stranger to this kind of treatment, but to see it so openly in a police department, a place meant to uphold justice, made his stomach twist. Yet, he kept his voice even. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks in here?" Bray raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Just the ones who don't belong." Admam nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. Part of him wanted to state his rank right then and there. But no, there was still one more thing he needed to see, and at that moment, Bray made his final mistake. Without warning, he spit straight into Admam's face, a silence that spoke volumes. The room was gripped by a suffocating silence the moment Bray's act was complete. It was as if time itself had frozen. A newly appointed police chief, or at least a man they had assumed to be a nobody, had just been humiliated in the most degrading way possible, right in the heart of the Blue Ridge Police Department. Admam Thoson stood still, his face calm, but inside a storm raged. He felt the warm spit slide down his cheek, vile and disgusting. A low chuckle came from the corner, a quiet shake of the head from another officer, but no one intervened. No one said a word. Bray remained where he was, arms crossed, his eyes gleaming with amusement. He was expecting anger, a punch, maybe even a shouted demand for respect. But instead, Admam slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a white handkerchief. With deliberate precision, he wiped his face clean, erasing not just the spit, but the insult itself. He said nothing to Bray. He didn't have to, because in just a few minutes they would all understand. Admom turned on his heels and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the precinct hallway. No one stopped him. No one asked where he was going. Maybe they thought he had been humiliated enough to leave. Maybe they thought he wouldn't dare return. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. A few minutes later, a voice crackled over the precinct's intercom. All personnel present in the department report to the briefing room immediately. Curious glances were exchanged among officers. Some shrugged and made their way down the hall toward the large meeting room where important discussions were held. Bray, still basking in his so-called triumph, strolled in with a smug grin, leaning casually against the wall. "What's this, some kind of joke?" he muttered. But the moment the door swung open and Admom Thoson stepped inside, the entire room was thrown into a stunned hush. He was no longer just a nameless outsider, no longer the man Bray had just humiliated. He stood tall, unwavering, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room, catching every reaction: shock, confusion, unease. And then he set a thick folder down on the table, cleared his throat, and shattered the suffocating silence. "Good morning. My name is Admom Thoson." His voice was steady, unyielding, "and I am officially your new chief of police." The room erupted into murmurs. Some officers exchanged panicked glances. A few looked down, ashamed, but no one was more visibly shaken than Bray. The color drained from his face. The arrogant smirk vanished. His eyes widened in horror, his body stiff as though he had been turned to stone. He had just spit in the face of his new boss. Admom stepped forward, his tone firm but controlled. "This morning, I didn't come here as your chief. I came as an observer. I wanted to see how this department functions when no one is watching, and I saw enough." He let the words settle in. The tension in the room was thick, pressing down on every person present. "I saw disrespect. I saw prejudice. And most of all, I saw a toxic culture that has been allowed to fester for years." Bray swallowed hard, pressing his back against the wall as if he could disappear. But there was nowhere to hide. Admom turned to face him, his eyes sharp as steel. "Officer Bray," he said, his voice slicing through the air, "your actions this morning were not just an insult to me. They were an insult to this entire department. You didn't just disgrace one person. You disgraced the very badge you wear on your chest." The weight of his words crushed the remaining laughter in the room. A few officers lowered their heads. Some had the decency to look ashamed. Admom's tone hardened. "Effective immediately, Officer Bray is suspended pending an internal investigation. And let me be perfectly clear, this department will no longer tolerate behavior like this." Bray clenched his jaw but didn't dare speak. Admom took a deep breath, then looked around the room at the rest of them. "For those of you willing to do better, I will lead you. But for those of you who want to cling to the old ways, walk out now, because from this moment on, everything changes." A heavy silence settled over the room, but this time, no one dared to laugh. The silence that spoke volumes. The air in the briefing room thickened the moment Admom Thoson revealed his identity. The murmurs dissipated, replaced by an unbearable stillness. Every pair of eyes locked onto him, some filled with disbelief, others with the slow realization of their mistake. Even Bray, the man who had just humiliated him in the very precinct he now commanded, was paralyzed. Just minutes ago, he had been the arrogant one, spitting at a stranger he assumed was a nobody. Now, he stood frozen, his chest tightening as he faced his newly appointed police chief. Admom stepped forward, resting both hands on the table. His sharp gaze cut through the room like a scalpel, dissecting each reaction: shame, nervousness, resentment. He let the weight of the moment settle before speaking. I did not come here this morning for a handshake or a staged welcome. I came to see how this department functions when no one is watching. And I saw enough. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few lowered their heads. Others exchanged glances, uncertain of what would come next. Admom's voice remained steady but firm. I saw unprofessionalism. I saw abuse of power. But the worst thing I saw was a culture of complicity, a system that has allowed rot to fester within these walls. That ends today. The last sentence hit like a hammer, reverberating through the room. Bray swallowed hard. He could feel the heat of the gazes now turning toward him. He heard the sharp inhales of breath, the unspoken question lingering in the air. What now? Admom turned his attention fully to Bray, his expression unreadable, his voice devoid of emotion. "Officer Bray," he said, and the room seemed to shrink. "Your actions this morning were not just an insult to me. They disgraced this department." A hush fell. "You did not just humiliate me," Admom continued, his voice unwavering. "You dishonored the badge on your chest. You dishonored everyone in this room who still believes in the integrity of law enforcement." Bray's mouth opened, ready to protest, but Admom silenced him with a raised hand. "You have nothing to say that can change what you did." He turned back to the room, letting his words sink in before delivering the final blow. "Let me be perfectly clear. This department will no longer tolerate disrespect, discrimination, or abuse of power under my leadership." The weight of his words pressed down like a tidal wave. Effective immediately, Officer Bray is suspended pending an internal investigation. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Bray's face drained of color. He gaped at Admom as if trying to comprehend the severity of the situation. Around him, officers exchanged nervous looks, some in shock, others in silent approval. "And consider this your warning," Admom addressed the entire room. "If any of you feel you cannot adapt to the standards I expect, there is the door. Leave now, because from this moment forward, we are setting a new course." No one moved. No one spoke. Bray clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. But for once, there was no defiance in his gaze. Admom's eyes swept over the room one last time. "For those willing to do better, I will lead you. For those who refuse, your time here will be short." Silence stretched again. Then finally, a young officer, likely a rookie, gave a slow nod. Another followed, and then another. Gradually, throughout the room, more nods appeared. The shift had begun. The shift begins. The air in the briefing room felt suffocating, as if every ounce of oxygen had been drained from it. All eyes were locked on Admom Thosan, the man who had just stepped onto the podium and shattered their illusions of control. The murmurs had vanished, the boisterous camaraderie snuffed out like a candle in a storm. Bray, the man who had, just minutes ago, laughed and spat at Admom, now stood frozen. His smug expression was gone, replaced with something far more human: fear. Admom let the silence stretch. Let them feel it. Let them absorb the weight of what was happening. Then, in a voice that was calm but edged with steel, he spoke. "I am Admom Thosan, and as of today, I am your new chief of police." A ripple of movement passed through the room. A few officers took deep breaths, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. No one dared to speak. Bray, however, looked as though he had been gut-punched. His lips parted, hands clenching at his sides. He couldn't comprehend how the man he had just humiliated wasn't some nobody, but the man who now owned his badge and his fate. But Admom wasn't finished. He stepped down from the podium, each stride toward Bray deliberate and measured. The sound of his footsteps against the tiled floor felt deafening in the silent room. "Officer Bray," he said, his voice steady, "would you like to explain yourself?" Bray opened his mouth, but Admom lifted a hand, stopping him cold. "Actually, let me explain for you." He turned back to the room, addressing every single officer who had stood by, complicit in the morning's humiliation. "I walked into this department today without announcing myself. I wanted to see how things ran when no one was watching. And I did." His gaze swept across the room, lingering just long enough to make several officers drop their eyes. "I saw complacency. I saw abuse of power, and I saw a toxic culture that has been allowed to thrive for far too long. We have a problem, and I am here to fix it." The silence deepened, pressing against them like a heavy weight. Bray swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He could feel the walls closing in, the way Admom's words stripped away the false security he had built for himself in this precinct. But Admom wasn't done. He took another step closer to Bray. "You spat in my face this morning." He said it plainly, letting the words settle like a boulder dropped into still water. Bray's fists clenched, but he didn't speak. Couldn't. "You thought I didn't matter. You thought I wasn't someone worth respecting. And more importantly, you thought there would be no consequences. You were wrong." A veteran officer let out a slow breath. Another officer shifted uneasily, avoiding Admom's gaze. "Let me make this clear to all of you," Admom said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "There will be zero tolerance for disrespect, discrimination, or abuse of power under my command." Then, with a finality that sent shockwaves through the room, he declared, "Effective immediately, Officer Bray is suspended pending an internal investigation." A collective intake of breath swept through the officers like a gust of wind. Some glanced at one another, disbelief etched on their faces. Others sat rigid, as if afraid that moving would make them the next target. Bray stood motionless. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Admom turned back toward the podium, his voice now lower, but no less firm. "Change is not easy, but it is necessary." He let that truth sink in. "I know some of you are unsettled. Some of you may be angry, but understand this. If you cannot uphold the standards of integrity, discipline, and accountability, then the door is right there. You are free to leave." No one moved. Admom nodded. "But if you are willing to do the right thing, if you want to be part of something better, then I will lead you." A young officer, perhaps only a few years into the job, gave a slight nod. Then another. And slowly, one by one, more heads began to nod. The shift had begun. The room felt as though it was vibrating with the weight of unspoken thoughts, the tension thick enough to be cut with a knife. Admom Thosan stood at the center of that tension, unyielding and calm, radiating a confidence that dared anyone to challenge him. Bray remained frozen, his face a mottled mixture of shock and rage. Only moments ago, he'd been reveling in his power, belittling a man he thought was beneath him. Now, he was the one being stripped of authority, left exposed and vulnerable before his peers. Admom let the silence linger a few seconds longer. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady, but carrying effortlessly through the room. "Today, I walked into this building as a stranger, and I witnessed the culture you have allowed to thrive here, and what I saw was deeply troubling." He scanned the room, his gaze resting briefly on each officer, making sure they felt seen. This morning's incident with Officer Bray is not just a reflection of one person's behavior. It is a symptom of a larger problem, a culture where disrespect, complacency, and bias are tolerated. Bray's face flushed even deeper, but he remained silent, knowing any protest would be futile. I'm not here to point fingers at every individual, Admom continued, but I am here to say that this culture ends today. He stepped back toward the podium, gripping the edge with both hands, and leaned forward. I understand that change is uncomfortable. I understand that accountability can be frightening. But I also know that it is necessary if we are to live up to the oath each of us took when we put on this uniform. A few officers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but attentive. The air felt heavy with the weight of reckoning. Officer Bray, Admom said, his voice clear and authoritative, your actions this morning were a disgrace, not just to me, but to the values that this department is supposed to represent. Bray's fists clenched, but he did not speak. With immediate effect, you are suspended pending an internal investigation, and let this be a message to everyone here. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated, not today, not ever. The room erupted with a collective intake of breath. Several officers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Bray looked as if he'd been physically struck. Admom's tone softened slightly as he turned his attention to the rest of the room. I know that not all of you condone this kind of behavior. I know that there are good officers here who believe in justice, who want to make a positive difference in this community. He took a deep breath. I am here to lead, not to tear down. I am here to build trust, to restore integrity, and to ensure that every officer in this department has a fair opportunity to do their best work. But understand this, if you are not committed to upholding the values of respect, professionalism, and equality, then you do not belong here. The room remained silent. No one moved, no one spoke. But there was a tangible shift in the atmosphere. It was as if a shadow had been lifted, allowing a sliver of light to break through. Admom straightened, letting his words resonate. For those who want to be part of something better, who are ready to hold themselves and their peers accountable, I am here for you. I will stand by you. I will lead you. And together, we will restore the honor of this department. One officer, a young woman sitting near the front, nodded slowly. Another officer, a veteran with a hardened expression, crossed his arms and nodded in agreement. Bray looked down at the floor, shoulders slumped, knowing that he'd lost not only his position, but also whatever respect he might have held among his peers. Admom's gaze swept over the room one final time. This is a new beginning. Let's make it one we can be proud of. There was no applause, no cheering, but there was a sense of quiet resolve, a shared understanding that something important had begun. As Admom stepped back, he knew that he had taken the first step toward real change, and while it would not be easy, he was ready for the battle ahead. Because today, he had done more than take control of a department. He had planted the seeds of transformation, and he knew that in time, those seeds would grow. The silence in the room was suffocating. A heavy, oppressive silence, as if no one could fully process what had just happened. Bray stood frozen in the middle of the crowd, his face flushed, not with anger, but with humiliation. He could feel the weight of every gaze on him, yet no one dared to stand up for him. And then there was Admom Thoson, the man he had mocked and spit on just moments ago, now standing before him as their newly appointed chief of police. You made a big mistake, Bray. Admom's voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that was undeniable. Bray swallowed hard. He could try to make excuses. He could claim he didn't know. But he did, and so did everyone else in the room. He hadn't just spat in the face of a random man, he had spat in the face of his own police chief. Admom took a step forward, his sharp gaze sweeping across the entire room. I saw you. I saw how you acted when you thought no one was watching. I saw who laughed, who turned away, who stayed silent. He let the words settle. And I also saw who didn't agree with what happened. A few officers looked up, surprised that the new chief had noticed them. He wasn't here just to punish. He was here to change things. Admom continued, his voice now edged with steel. As chief of police, I will not tolerate any form of disrespect in this department. I don't care what you think of me, but I do care about how you treat each other and the community you serve. He paused, letting his words sink deep into the minds of every officer present. Then he turned to Bray. And you, Officer Bray? Bray stiffened. You are immediately suspended pending an internal investigation. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some officers exchanged uneasy glances, while others kept their heads down. But no one objected. Bray opened his mouth as if to argue, but then realization dawned on him. There was no excuse that could save him now. He had done this to himself. His jaw clenched, fists tightening at his sides. But then, without another word, he nodded, turned on his heel, and walked out of the room. Tension lingered in the silence that followed. When the door shut behind Bray, Admom took a slow, measured breath before turning back to face the remaining officers. Who here thinks I'm overreacting? His eyes scanned the room. No one spoke, but he knew they were thinking it. He continued, his voice firm and unwavering. Those of you unwilling to change, unwilling to wear this badge with honor and respect, I suggest you leave now. He let the challenge hang in the air. But those who want to stay, those who want to do the right thing, those who want to restore the honor of the badge they wear, I will stand with you. We will rebuild this department from the inside out. He looked around the room. Some officers remained hesitant, but he could see others, ones who were really listening, ones who were starting to think. And with that, he knew the battle had only just begun. Change began in that moment. The conference room still echoed with the weight of what had just transpired. Some officers sat frozen in place, others avoided Admom Thosan's gaze, but they all felt it. Change was coming. Bray, who only minutes ago had been brimming with arrogance, now stood before Admom, his face drained of all color. I didn't know. He tried to grasp at some excuse, but nothing felt sufficient. Admom's sharp gaze remained fixed on him. You didn't know who I was. But does that even matter? Bray swallowed hard. If I weren't your police chief, would what you did be acceptable? If I were just a civilian walking into this station, would I have deserved your contempt? Silence swallowed the room. No one spoke, because everyone knew the answer. And that is the problem. Admom's voice rang out, steady and unwavering, like a hammer striking through the tension in the air. How can we serve justice if we don't even understand right from wrong ourselves? He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across every officer in the room. I didn't come here to be your enemy, but I also didn't come here to accept a police department rotting from the inside. He turned back to Bray. Officer Bray, you are immediately suspended. Bray clenched his fists, his jaw tight, but he didn't argue. He knew he had crossed the line. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving behind a weight that settled over the entire department. But Admom wasn't done. He turned to the remaining officers, his gaze piercing. What about the rest of you? His voice was steady, but carried undeniable gravity. How many of you have stayed silent when you saw wrongdoing? How many of you have laughed, agreed, or turned away because you thought it wasn't your problem? One by one, heads dropped. No one dared to answer. But Admom could see it on their faces, the discomfort, the reflection, the realization. He took a deep breath. If you think this is just about me and Bray, then you're wrong. He paused, letting the moment sink in. This is about you. A few officers lifted their heads, exchanging uneasy glances. They were beginning to understand the true significance of this moment. Justice cannot be just a slogan. It has to be a principle we uphold. And if we can't do that within our own department, how can we expect the people to trust us? The words lingered. Then he nodded. The door to change is open. If you want to step through, I'll walk forward with you. If you don't, he let the words hang for a moment. Then leave before I make you. A ripple of tension passed through the room. Then movement. One officer stood. It was Reyes, a young rookie. I want to do better. Her voice wavered slightly, but her eyes burned with determination. A beat of silence. Then another officer stood, and another. Slowly, one by one, more began to rise. Admam looked at them, and for the first time that day, a small smile tugged at his lips. They were ready for change, and he would stand with them. And the truth cannot stay buried forever. A cold wind swept through the parking lot as Admam Thoson stood staring at the police station. Under the dim streetlights, he could see a group of officers gathered near the front entrance, murmuring among themselves. They didn't realize he was watching. He already knew what they were saying. News of Bray's suspension had spread like wildfire. Some disagreed, some stayed silent, but one thing was certain, no one dared to say anything to his face. Atmam wasn't surprised. He had seen this fear before. The fear of those who had grown comfortable in a broken system, those who believed change would never come. But today, everything was different. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, as if the entire room had been weighed down by the burden of truth. Officers who had been chatting and laughing moments ago suddenly fell silent. A few dropped their gazes to their desks, pretending to be busy. Atmam stepped into the center of the room. Everyone, I have an announcement. His voice was clear, steady, and unwavering, the kind that commanded attention. All eyes turned to him. He scanned the room before continuing. This department is changing. If you can't adapt, you should leave before I make that decision for you. No one spoke, but he saw the furrowed brows, the nervous glances. I know some of you think I'm here to put on a show, but I'm not here to intimidate. I'm here to clean up this department, and I don't care who feels uncomfortable because of it. For a moment, the entire room felt frozen. Then, from the back, a voice spoke up. What about the ones who were already here? Atmam turned. Reyes, a young officer, stepped forward. She met his gaze with sharp eyes, as if testing him. You want to clean up this department, but what about those of us who have been threatened, forced into silence? Can you promise that we'll be safe? A heavy silence settled over the room. Some officers shifted in their seats. Others exchanged wary glances, as if wondering whether they should support her. Atmam held her gaze. He understood her doubt. I can't promise that change will be easy, but I can promise that you won't be alone. If anyone here is threatened, intimidated, or pressured by those who refuse to change, I will stand with you. Reyes clenched her fists. Then, after a few seconds, she nodded. A door had opened, and then something unexpected happened. One officer stood up, then another, and another. They began showing their support, not with words, but with action. They were ready to stand up. Atmam looked at them, and for the first time that day, a faint smile crossed his face. Change had begun. The truth cannot stay hidden forever, Atmam. Thoson walked into the police station with a clear purpose. Today would be the turning point. A day when no one in this department could avoid responsibility any longer. The tension in the station had been thick ever since Bray's suspension. Whispers of change had begun spreading, but no one dared to speak openly. They were waiting, unsure of what this shift would bring. He scanned the room. Some officers avoided his gaze, while others smirked, feigning indifference. But he knew. They were all watching him. They wanted to see if he would truly stand by his words. Today, he would give them an answer. When he entered the main briefing room, the officers were already gathered, waiting for the meeting he had called earlier that morning. The murmurs softened as he stepped inside. Bray wasn't here. Of course, he wasn't. But his presence still lingered in the way some officers exchanged glances, as if sharing a secret they believed Atmom wasn't privy to. He didn't let it shake him. Atmom strode to the front, placed both hands on the podium, and let his gaze sweep the room. Do you know why we're here today? Silence. A slow, knowing smile crossed his face, but there was no warmth in it. I'm sure you've all heard about the investigation. A few officers shifted in their seats. You also know that Bray has been suspended. Some narrowed their eyes. Others clasped their hands together, bracing for what was coming. But no one objected. Good. He tapped his fingers lightly on the desk, the sound echoing in the quiet room. But today, I'm not just here to talk about Bray. He paused. I'm here to talk about all of you. A wave of confusion spread across the room. We can't keep pretending that the problem is just one man. Bray is not the only issue in this department. What we are dealing with is a culture. Not a single word was spoken. Atmom continued. Let's be honest with each other. How many times have you seen something wrong and stayed silent? How many times have you witnessed someone being treated unfairly and done nothing? No one answered. An officer cleared his throat, looking away. Your silence does not make you innocent. He let that statement settle in the air. Some frowned. Others stared down at their desks, but no one contradicted him. Today, I have just one question for you. Do you want to be part of the problem or part of the solution? The weight of his words pressed down on the room. Then, from the back, someone stood up. Reyes, the youngest officer in the room. She met his gaze with unwavering determination. I choose to be part of the solution. Heads turned toward her, some in surprise, others in skepticism. Then another officer stood up, and another, and another. Change never comes from silence. When an environment allows injustice, prejudice, and disrespect to thrive, the problem isn't just the wrongdoers, it's also those who remain silent. Atmom Thosan's story shows that responsibility doesn't just fall on those who commit wrongdoing, but also on those who stand by and watch. A society only truly changes when people have the courage to stand up, face the truth, and take action. Courage isn't just about confronting evil, it's about inspiring others to step out of their comfort zones. Sometimes all it takes is one person to start, and an entire system can be transformed. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.